Hello and welcome to Deep Dive with me, Mitali Mukherjee. Since 2014 and the incoming of the Modi government, there's been a lot of analysis by political watchers, political analysts about the nature of India's democracy and whether its fabric, its tone, its tenor has changed and changed to what degree and in what direction. In her recently released book, Mukulika Banerjee looks at exactly that facet. Cultivating Democracy is the name of her book, and she looks at this interestingly from an agrarian lens. What is the value of a vote for someone who lives in rural India? What are the reasons they vote for? What are the trends and patterns that make them vote for or against a particular candidate? And what stands out really as the broad arches and indeed challenges to democracy as we look at it now? Is it the fact that finances are playing a bigger and bigger role in terms of how they determine a political party's heft? Is it that institutions are getting increasingly influenced by one particular party versus the other? Or is it that there's been a sea change in terms of ideology or a belief on what democracy and democratic institutions stand for? Let's talk about all of that with the author herself. Thank you, Mukulika, for joining in. Congratulations on another book from you. When I was reading the introduction, the line or the term that struck me was when you talked about democracy while it still existed in India in defensible form. Uh, how would you define the period that we are now living through?
I think India's institutional backsliding on democratic credentials is severe and rapid at the moment. We are talking on a day just after a new bill has been passed in Parliament, again, rushed through without debate and discussion, which links voter ID with Aadhaar, which was never the intended use of Aadhaar. It is, what we are witnessing in India at the moment is exactly what the political scientists Levitsky and Ziblatt describe in their book, When Democracies Die. They say in that book that democracies no longer die with military coups and tanks on the street. Democracies die because they eat themselves. That this is not their term, but what they're saying is that when you take over democratic institutions to kill democracy. So really what we are witnessing in India is what we are witnessing elsewhere in the world, but in India it's a severe case where democratic institutions are being cynically used to destroy democratic culture. So the one shining light of India's democratic institutions was the Election Commission of India. Myself and many others have written books about how incredible the Indian electoral exercise was and what an extraordinary feat it was that such a large electorate pulled off such a largely free and fair election. And that whole electoral system has been utterly and thoroughly corrupted now with this new linking of Aadhaar and voter ID. But even before that, the complete compromise of the independence of the Election Commission of India. Even before that, the introduction of electoral bonds that deliberately made electoral funding opaque.
Yeah.
And even before that, the compromise of the secrecy of the ballot, because votes are no longer mixed across different EVMs. We know the voting pattern of every polling booth, and that is not a secret ballot when you can tell how 1,000 people have voted. That's not a secret ballot anymore. And unfortunately, many people don't realize this. So it's very sad. And so that's why it's with great sadness that one makes this observation, as I do in my preface, that this book that's just out, it's the book that was written on the basis of research conducted between 1998 and 2013. And at that point, India's democracy worked according to recognizable credentials.
Yeah.
That era has passed.
So I want to talk about, all the three important pillars that you alluded to, but The two things that stand out in terms of how we've morphed since 2014, Mukulika, is one, that there is a very strong communal angle to this conversation about democracy. And second, that it is at least presented to be the majority view, the fact that most people want it to be in this form. I was speaking a couple of weeks back with Professor Jaffrilo, who made the point that India's democracy is now a majoritarian democracy, where you're working towards that mythical Hindu state. How would you define where we are in terms of this democratic journey or process right now? If you had to, plot us, where are we?
I think we are in a point where, after 75 years, we have a fairly thorough familiarity with democratic culture. We know how it is to behave democratically, right? But we also have a complete and utter corruption of democratic institutions. So, parliament has been hollowed out of meaning. Elections are being hollowed out of any probity. The media are no longer neutral and fair and holding elected representatives to account. All the institutions of of any recognizable democracy, have been corrupted. But one of the things that I would say as a social anthropologist is that a democracy is not just about its institutions. You also need a democratic culture. You need, in India, I think, it's very interesting if you go back to its constitutional moment. One of the one of the terms that Ambedkar absolutely insisted on, and he had to insist not because others opposed it, but because others did not understand the significance of the difference between the words democracy and republic. Right? And Ambedkar at that point said, no, we must be a sovereign democratic republic. And others said, well, we are a sovereign republic, why isn't that enough? And he said, no, because they're two separate things. A democracy is really about political democracy, it's about institutions. But a republic is about social democracy, it's about economic democracy. It is what we will call democratic culture. And this, you ask, where we are in India, democratic culture in India is still very much alive and kicking. It isn't, I don't believe that, this is a naturally, that it's a foregone conclusion that we are going to go the way that the majoritarian agenda is taking the country. Because there are plenty of counterexamples. I mean, the latest one, of course, has been the huge protests by the farmers and the climb down of the government in response to it. There are other examples. And in this, it's worth noting that democratic cultures require you to behave in ways that go against maybe human instincts, that go against majoritarian supremacy. It's a set of dispositions and attitudes that you need to cultivate. You need to believe in redistribution. You need to believe in accommodation.
Let me get to one of the pillars that you talked about, which is the election commission. And I want to go back to the most recent experience that we've had with elections, which is in West Bengal, where many of the state government representatives, leaders, political aides made the point that this was an election that they fought literally against the institutional mechanics and the institutional machinery. The way phases had been planned, the way things had been planned, seemed very clearly to be leaning towards one versus the other. How did you read the West Bengal election outcome in that light? And what are the dangers as you see them progressing from the election commission's point of view? Because only a few days back, again, there was a questionable meeting that happened, Mukulika, which did not seem like it checked the boxes in terms of propriety, but there you have it. All three electoral election commission heads were sitting in that meeting with the central government.
And that was shocking. It was interesting that the chief election commissioner did initially register his displeasure or question being summoned like this. The Election Commission of India has a constitutional independence. It is not some convention. It's constitutionally mandated to be an independent body, independent of the elected government. And in this aspect of institutional design, India is streets ahead of most countries, which is why countries, even like the UK, the UK set up, the United Kingdom set up its election commission in 2001. And when they did, India was there to um, advise them, because election commissions in large numbers of countries are managed by the ruling government. And in India, that's not the case. But what has happened is precisely this corruption, where the Election Commission of India has been forcibly made partisan, which is not what it should be. And right up until between 2014 and 2019, you will remember that one of the election commissioners, when he registered a dissenting note because he was not going to let it pass what the election commission was asked, his entire family was hounded. This is a huge price to, this is how a really honorable system like the election commission is being compromised. So West Bengal was therefore, watched. This book covers a period in which 9 elections were held in West Bengal. So I've watched a lot of elections in West Bengal. This one, I had to watch it out from London, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But it was, you could see that the verdict was going to be despite the election commission. That the election commission, this wasn't a free and fair election. This wasn't a level playing ground. So the level playing field had been practically dug up by the election commission, and indeed the electoral bonds. The disproportionate amount of money that one party can spend and compared to any of the others meant that you really have to feel quite strongly about who you want to vote for, despite all the pressures, despite all the money being thrown at you, despite being, this is like the shock and awe strategy of fighting elections that we see from one political party. And despite that, people voted the way they did, which said something about, it told us 2 things. One is that there is a nascent support for a Hindu majoritarian agenda in West Bengal that is rising from one election to the other. The vote share is increasing, the seat share is increasing. But at the end of the day, people also felt that the sheer money and misogyny of one political party actually lost a lot of support, and people did not want to vote for them.
Yeah. I was also struck by, a really important note that you point to in your book, which I think is important given the current frustration around the lack of an opposition, where, you narrate a conversation with someone who's in the village. National and state level elections are only dress rehearsals for the real election of the panchayat, Majhi told me. And as people confirmed, this was indeed the election they most cared about, because the candidates were people they knew personally. Governance decisions and budget disbursements would determine what would happen with their life. And then you go on to also quote a line where he says, where a member from the TMC says, winning this election will give us real power, khamata, and capacity to bring change. I think there's such an important lesson over there, Mukulika, for the opposition parties that we're looking at, where it really has to be an approach that is bottom up. There is absolutely no other way to look at it.
Absolutely. I could not agree more, Mitali, with what you've just said. West Bengal, I think, teaches us 2 lessons on this particular issue. One is that because it has this extraordinary example, for 34 years, you had the left front winning power. And yet, did we say that democracy was over because one party dominated? No, because when you look at the vote share, distribution between political parties. The Congress was the main opposition party until Trinamool was formed in 1998. All those years, between 1977 and 1998, the Congress voters continued to vote for Congress. So often it was getting 40% vote share at a time when they knew the Congress would never win. but they wanted to vote for their opposition, for their party, because it was their party. And they said, we know they're not going to win, but you don't stop voting for your kind of politics just because you're not going to win. How else do you have democracy? You've got to have multiple parties in the fray, and all parties should feel that somebody still wants to vote for them. So that I think is key at a time of any one party dominance, any time in any state or nationally in any country, but certainly in India, that one of the things that a democracy allows the ordinary voter is for them to vote for who they think is their party, or the party that speaks to their interest. The second really big question, that the quote that you just repeated from the book tells us, which I think is one of the most understudied aspects of India's democracy, which is such a rich field of scholarship. And I'm slightly surprised by how little work we have on this. One is that we actually have very little scholarship on panchayat and municipal elections, how they're conducted, who conducts them, what are the rules of engagement. We've studied the Election Commission of India so thoroughly and so well, but at the end of the day, the Election Commission of India conducts only national, it conducts the Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha elections. They don't conduct the local elections. The local elections are conducted by state election commissions, which are set up in an ad hoc fashion. In every state, it's slightly different. They're often retired IAS officers running them, so they don't have the teeth of the administrative machinery behind them, unlike the other elections. And this is bizarre because, as we learned from that quote, for a lot of people, that local election is the most important. It is the coalface, it is the most immediate, proximate face of the Indian state or the Indian elected representatives they see. They know the name of their pradhan. They know who their councillors are in many cases in urban areas. And people care about those elections. And yet we don't actually know much about the state capacity of those institutions, nor do we know very much about the elections at that level.
Hmm. It also remains a bit of a question mark about what the rural voter votes on, Mukulika. I mean, of course, India is too diverse to sort of put it all into one silo. In Uttar Pradesh, for example, it seems like caste lines run very deep and do make an impact on decision making. Perhaps it's different for a smaller state like Goa. What was your own impression, though? When it comes down to the crux of it, for a rural voter, what are they looking to hear? What is it that they are ultimately making their voting decision based on?
Speaking about West Bengal, I saw one of the arcs covered by the book was the arc of the heyday, the hegemony of the left front to its complete decline and its ouster. Right? So the left front in its heyday uh, was also an extremely complacent political establishment that pretty much took especially its rural electorate for granted. So all I'm saying is that there was plenty wrong with it. But one thing that people really continued to vote for them was because it was the first political party that had given poor manual workers dignity. Dignity is critical, right? And so people felt that yes, there may be corruption, yes, there may be violence, yes, there may be all kinds of things wrong with a particular political party, but at the end of the day, they treated us as human, which in a country like India, with the kinds of with the deep levels of social inequality we have, if you're at the bottom of the social heap, then to be treated with dignity and respect actually means a lot. And this translates to not just welfare, but being enabled. It is that sort of capability theory idea of being able to at least be given the opportunities. This is why Mamata's idea of giving every schoolgirl a bicycle to get to school is so powerful. It's not about giving money. It's about saying, okay, we know that the reason why you can't continue your education is because your family cannot stump up the bus fare for you to get to school or to degree college. And to be given a bicycle enables her. And this kind of thing is recognized and rewarded with votes. So that's just one example of the kind of thing. I think dignity is really critical for. The other thing is we have a bizarre um, stereotype of rural India by all urban, amongst your listeners here and readers of the Wire and elsewhere. Urban and enlightened as many people are lack of understanding of rural India is really quite astonishing.
Yeah.
And so we sort of, have this idea that, oh, they'll do what we tell them to do, or they can be paid off, or, oh, village is really about caste and social division. And, it's a den of vice. It's that Ambedkar idea that the village is a den of vice that we all work with, and certain kinds of Bombay films perpetuate that idea of the badlands of rural India. And yet, one of the big points about the book that I'm making is that actually agrarian and village and rural life have have incredible capacity for creating values, through not through politics, but through social institutions of festivals, of bringing in a harvest or managing social affairs in such a close knit community that I say have the capacity for creating, the social imaginaries for democracy and really progressive ideas of social cohesion. And if this sounds a bit sort of la landish about rural India, I think last year was 2020 was a real eye opener on rural India. First, when we saw migrants when locked down at 4 hours' notice, just rushing, somehow trying to get back to the rural hinterlands. They had to leave because there were no jobs there, but they left and they'd come. But when there was nothing, they went back. And when journalists and scholars asked them why they're going, they said, at least in a village, you don't die alone. If you're dying, somebody is there to give you a few drops of water in a way that urban India, for all its glitz and glamour and opportunities of employment, you literally die like a dog, is what people were saying, right? So the fact that we had to sit up and take notice of rural India happened with those migrants just turning their back on urban India, saying, no, this is no place for human beings to live because you don't care about each other. And then, from September onwards, when we saw the farmers just getting organized to fight with their bodies, literally, and with complete patience and stubbornness, these laws that they didn't want, you suddenly thought, hang on, these are farmers? I mean, again, there was a bit of we had to do a little bit of recalibration on our ideas of what rural India and farmers were capable of. And in a sense, my book kind of is really an examination of these issues that we've seen in 2020 in public life in such glory. But the book gives you a much deeper examination of how is it that village India has the capacity to create these values.
There is there are 2 points of view about this farmer protest and the impact it may go on to have, Mukulika. For some people, it is almost a pivotal moment where something has changed and something has switched in the mood and the pulse of how people expect to exercise their dissent. And for others, it seems like it's one of those bumps, and it's behind the current dispensation, like it was with the migrant crisis, like it was with the second wave of COVID. What's your own sense? Because you studied the agrarian, you studied things with an agrarian lens quite deeply. What's your sense of what impact the farmers' movement may have for this conversation we're having in the grid of democracy?
I think the fact that in a democracy like India, where 60% of India really does still live in its villages, it took something as big as this sort of 379-day movement to make it a national conversation. That, this wasn't part. Why don't we have much more examination and debate and discussion about agrarian reform, much in a much more sustained, informed way?
Yeah.
In a bizarre way, these three rushed laws started that conversation. And wherever you stood, at least people took positions, they examined the rights and wrongs of these laws, they taught themselves about agriculture. Most people didn't even know what MSP stood for, why you need an MSP,
Which
and
crops
what is
damage,
the
which
difference.
crops don't. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, and why are we so resistant to giving uh, rural India any of the fail-safe options that we would give, say, the stock exchange, or any regulatory mechanism that you wouldn't dream of running a market without, in manufacturing, you would not give to agriculture. So I think uh, it has focused the national mind a little bit, where people can't just say, "Oh, that's nothing to do with me" anymore, because it literally brought traffic into India's national capital to a halt. Right. That's the first thing. Um, the second thing is that I think farmers, just by showing how you resist something that you feel has been not only thrust upon you, but thrust upon you by violating every parliamentary norm that any self respecting democracy signs up to. If you're going to rush through things and not allow debate and discussion and then insist it's good for people, it's a little bit like other legislations this parliament has passed. We have seen how much effort goes into maintaining a protest. Now, this wasn't, it may have been spontaneous anger, but you don't sustain a 1 year plus movement spontaneously. It takes organization, it takes hard work, it takes patience, it takes commitment to resist authoritarian government like the present one in India. So it's a lesson for anyone who wants to resist any authoritarian moves of this government. I mean, what we were talking about a minute ago about this new linking of voter ID with Aadhaar. Now,
Yeah.
this is not a farmer's issue. This affects every single Indian citizen. If people are serious about resisting that new legislation, then we know what we have to do. I mean, you have to organize, agitate, and sustain it until the government is forced to climb back down.
Yeah. Although honestly, I'm somewhat surprised by the lack of information and depth that urban India often displays about these issues, as opposed to the solid research-backed information that rural India has when it relates to laws that impact them. So I really hope that there's more noise made about this, but I'm not sure. Let me ask you a final question, Mukulika. You've talked about compromised institutions, you've talked about campaign finance and how money is now skewed to one side, the EVM debate as well. But you go on to end this by saying the integrity of elections and procedural democracy in India stands thoroughly compromised, and it can be defensibly argued that elections in India have become a game to win at any cost. I'm paraphrasing here. But given the elements that you're seeing, the straws in the wind, Mukulika, what do you expect to see in the elections to come? Because there are some very key state elections coming up. By 2024, we'll be rolling around to a general election again. The the reason I ask you this is because one feels like it's so bad right now. You wonder how much more deceleration one should expect to see.
Well, frankly, if India continues to conduct elections in the manner in which it conducts elections now, and now with these other new legislations brought in, um, sadly, they've been hollowed out of meaning, and yet they allow certain parties and governments to become what are called electoral authoritarian governments. That's, and the reason why you need to win an election at any cost is because winning an election gives you the legitimacy of being a democratic country, right? So you can get invited to Joe Biden's summit of world democracies. It allows India to be part of the axis of democracies aligned against China, because that is the big global formation at the moment. That is everybody's priority. So, as long as you can keep up the veneer of being a democracy, it allows you into the club of democracies. I should say here that I'm, of course, very aware, as I study contemporary India, I read the news very regularly. I'm very aware of the touchiness of Indian governments and its representatives and ministers on being criticized for slipping on the democratic index,
The
on
press
various
freedom
kinds of
index, yeah, yeah.
the VDEM index and so on. I should say that, as somebody who's been studying this for over 20 years, I am not judging India's democracy on the basis of necessarily on the basis of international indices.
Okay.
I think we need to judge India's performance in elections and as a democracy against her own record, against what it has managed to achieve in its own capacity of uh, pulling off this incredible exercise of on a Lok Sabha election in India is a mammoth exercise that used to be done with a certain flair and commitment by the Election Commission of India. That has been compromised. But the electoral bonds in 2016 legitimized hiding the sources of campaign finance in a way that India itself did not used to have earlier. So, just measured against her own credentials, I think India comes out uh, with a sham of a democratic institutional structure. But as I said at the start, I think it is very important for us to also remember that one of the advantages of having had a career as a democracy for 75 years, Indian citizens have also been through have voted in several elections, and so there is a familiarity of what is right, what is acceptable. When the Election Commission of India looks the other way and doesn't reprimand political parties and politicians for hate speech or for misogyny, as we saw in the West Bengal elections, the electorate knows that this is not all right. This is not what we allow in our elections. And that is what people were saying. And so I think somewhere we have to have some faith in the democratic capacity of Indian citizens too, to see how the story progresses over the next few elections.
A somber but important conversation, Mukulika. Thank you so much for joining in. Congratulations on your book again, and I'm so glad we got to discuss such a wide range of issues. I wish you all the best. Thank you again for the chat today.
Thank you very much, Mitali, for reading the book and for your fantastic questions. Thanks.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.